Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're really excited to explore a new book together. We're diving into 1 Kings.
Oh, 1 Kings, yeah.
Looking for the wisdom it holds for Christian believers.
Okay.
So we want to see how its stories
Yeah.
and teachings can help us live with, more faith and more compassion.
More faith, more compassion.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. 1 Kings is all about transitions.
Okay.
It picks up right after the reign of David, following the stories of those who came after him.
Oh, wow.
It's a powerful look at leadership, at faith, and at trying to live a life that honors God.
So we're diving into the lives of these kings and the lessons they learned. Sounds intense.
It is. And we begin with Solomon,
Okay.
perhaps the most famous king from this book.
Right.
He's known for his incredible wisdom.
Solomon, yeah.
But it's not just about being clever or strategic.
There's more to it than just being smart.
Absolutely. The Bible makes it very clear that Solomon's wisdom was a gift from God.
In 1 Kings 3, we see Solomon humbly asking God for the ability to govern justly and to understand what is right.
Wow.
He knew that true wisdom comes from seeking God's guidance.
That reminds me of that famous story, the one where two women both claimed to be the mother of the same baby.
Yes.
How did Solomon figure that one out?
Oh, that story. That story is a powerful example of how Solomon used his God-given wisdom to uncover the truth and to act with compassion. His decision wasn't just about being clever.
Right.
It was about understanding human nature,
Yeah.
discerning what was right,
Okay.
and ultimately reflecting the wisdom of God.
It's a reminder that true wisdom isn't just about knowledge. It's about applying that knowledge with justice and mercy.
Absolutely.
It's like his wisdom wasn't just for solving tricky problems, but for leading with real understanding and compassion.
Exactly, and his wisdom went far beyond human affairs.
Okay.
1 Kings 4 tells us that Solomon's knowledge extended to all of creation.
He could speak about everything from the mighty cedars of Lebanon to the smallest hyssop plant.
So he wasn't just a wise ruler, but a keen observer of the natural world.
Precisely. This shows us that his God-given wisdom gave him a deep appreciation for all of God's creation. And it reminds us that as Christians,
Yeah.
we're called to care for God's creation as well.
Speaking of being impressed by Solomon's wisdom, we can't forget about the Queen of Sheba. She traveled a very long way to meet him.
The Queen of Sheba's visit in 1 Kings 10 is fascinating. She was drawn by the reports of Solomon's wisdom and the prosperity of his kingdom.
Right.
When she arrived, she was absolutely astounded by what she saw and heard.
It's like his wisdom and the blessings of his kingdom were a testament to his faith.
Yes. The Queen of Sheba's reaction is a powerful reminder that when we live a life guided by faith, seeking God's wisdom and following his ways, it can lead to blessings that inspire others and even draw them closer to God.
Okay, so we've got this incredibly wise king, and that seems like a pretty good foundation for a kingdom.
Yeah.
But 1 Kings isn't all about Solomon's brilliance, is it? There's that whole story about building the temple, right?
Absolutely. The construction of the temple is a pivotal moment in 1 Kings.
Right.
And a testament to Solomon's faith.
Right.
It wasn't just a building project.
Right.
It was a sacred undertaking.
Yeah.
And that's reflected in how it was built.
What do you mean?
Well, 1 Kings 5 describes the incredible collaboration between Solomon and King Hiram of Tyre.
Okay.
They worked together to gather the finest materials and the most skilled craftsmen.
Right.
And there's this fascinating detail. All the stones for the temple were cut and prepared beforehand.
Wow.
So no sound of hammering or chiseling was heard during the actual construction.
Wow. It's like they were treating the project itself as something holy.
Exactly. It's a beautiful picture of the reverence and care they put into creating a place dedicated to God.
Right.
This careful preparation and quiet dedication remind us that our faith is something we build thoughtfully and with a sense of awe.
And once the temple was completed, Solomon offered a prayer of dedication.
Yes.
What can we learn from that?
Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8 is incredibly powerful. Even as king,
Yeah.
he approaches God with humility,
Right.
acknowledging that everything he has, his wisdom, his kingdom, the temple itself, is a gift from God.
Right.
He recognizes God's greatness and submits to his will.
And I remember that he prays for all people.
Yes.
Not just the Israelites, but even foreigners.
That part of his prayer is especially beautiful.
Yeah.
It reflects the expansive and inclusive nature of God's love.
Right.
Solomon asks God to hear the prayers of anyone who turns to him, regardless of their background.
Wow.
It reminds us that God's love is universal and that we as Christians are called to embrace that same openness extending compassion to everyone.
So it's like he's saying that the temple isn't just a building for one group of people, but a symbol of God's love for all humanity.
That's a wonderful way to put it.
Yeah.
It challenges us to see beyond our own communities and to recognize the image of God in every person we encounter.
That's a powerful message of unity and compassion.
Yeah.
But 1 Kings doesn't shy away from the more difficult parts of Solomon's story, does it?
That's right.
The book takes a bit of a darker turn later on.
As we move further into 1 Kings, we see that even Solomon, with all his wisdom and blessings, wasn't immune to temptation.
The book tells us that he allowed the influence of his many foreign wives to lead him away from God, causing him to worship other gods.
This part of Solomon's story serves as a cautionary tale.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that even the wisest among us can stumble and fall.
Right.
We are all susceptible to temptation.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to guard our hearts and minds.
Okay.
Staying rooted in our faith and seeking God's strength to resist those things that pull us away from Him.
And the consequences of his choices were pretty significant.
Yes, they were.
After Solomon's death, the once unified kingdom was divided.
Exactly.
Right.
That division is a stark reminder that our actions have consequences, not only for ourselves, but for others as well.
Okay.
When we turn away from God's path, it can have a ripple effect,
right,
impacting those around us and even future generations.
It's like a reminder that our choices matter, both in our personal lives and in the broader context of our communities and nations.
Absolutely. And that theme of choices and consequences continues throughout the book of 1 Kings.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we see it in the story of Jeroboam, who was appointed king over the northern tribes after the kingdom split.
Jeroboam was worried about the people traveling to the temple in Jerusalem to worship, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
He feared that if they continued to worship in Jerusalem, they might eventually reunite with the southern kingdom under the rule of the house of David.
Oh.
So he made a decision that would have lasting consequences.
Oh, what did he do?
Instead of trusting in God and leading the people in faithful worship, he set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, creating alternative places of worship.
He was essentially trying to control where people's loyalty lay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jeroboam's actions highlight the danger of allowing fear and political maneuvering to compromise our faith. He created idols, leading the people astray from the true worship of God.
It's a sobering reminder that even when we think we're acting in our own best interest, we must always be careful not to replace God with false idols or compromise our values.
That's right.
So even with all the wisdom Solomon had at the beginning, we see how easy it is for people to get caught up in power, fear, and temptation.
That's the human condition, isn't it? We're all capable of great things, but also prone to make mistakes.
Right.
That's why it's so important to stay connected to God, to seek His guidance, and to lean on His strength. And that's one of the key messages that emerges from 1 Kings.
Great.
It's a book that explores the complexities of leadership, the challenges of faith, and the importance of making choices that honor God.
It's amazing how this book manages to be so dramatic and full of intrigue, but also packed with wisdom. It feels like every story has something to teach us about faith and how to live a life that's pleasing to God.
It really does. And what's fascinating is how seemingly small details can reveal profound truths about our relationship with God and the challenges we face as believers.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Well, think about the description of Solomon's lavish lifestyle in 1 Kings 10.
Okay.
The text mentions his golden drinking vessels and how silver was practically worthless during his reign.
He was incredibly wealthy.
Yes.
It seems like that would be a sign of God's blessing, wouldn't it?
It certainly was a sign of prosperity.
Yeah.
But it also hints at the potential pitfalls of excess. It raises questions about how we as Christians navigate a world where material wealth is so often valued above spiritual riches.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of material things and lose sight of what truly matters.
Exactly. It's a timeless challenge and one that 1 Kings encourages us to think about carefully. How do we balance material blessings with spiritual values? How do we ensure that our hearts are focused on God, even when surrounded by abundance?
Those are questions worth pondering. But let's not forget the positive aspects of Solomon's reign.
Okay.
His wisdom and leadership clearly had a positive impact,
yes,
as we saw with the Queen of Sheba's visit.
Yes. 1 Kings 10 paints such a vivid picture of her journey, laden with gifts and eager to experience Solomon's wisdom firsthand.
Right.
And she was not disappointed.
She was completely blown away by everything she saw and heard.
Exactly. The text tells us there was no more spirit in her.
Wow.
Meaning she was overwhelmed with awe and admiration. It's a powerful reminder that a life lived in accordance with God's wisdom can inspire others and even draw them closer to faith.
Right.
It's like a beacon shining in the darkness, showing others the beauty and the truth of a life lived for God.
So we've talked a lot about Solomon, but 1 Kings introduces us to a whole cast of characters.
Yes, it does.
Each with their own unique story to tell.
That's right.
What are some of the things that stand out to you about the kings who came after Solomon?
One thing that's really striking is how their reigns often reflect their choices and their relationship with God.
Okay.
We see kings like Asa and Jehoshaphat who, despite their imperfections, are generally described as following in the footsteps of David, seeking to honor God and to lead the people in righteousness.
And then there are kings like Ahab who completely abandoned God's ways, leading the people into idolatry and facing some pretty devastating consequences.
That's right.
Yeah.
The contrast between these reigns reinforces the message that obedience to God leads to blessing, while disobedience leads to suffering.
Right.
It's a recurring theme in 1 Kings, this idea that our choices have consequences.
Right.
Not just for ourselves, but for those around us and even for future generations.
It seems like the book isn't just telling us what happened.
Right.
But it's giving us insights into the motivations behind the king's decisions.
Yes.
For example, with Jeroboam, we see his political savvy, but also his fear.
You're referring to his decision to set up those golden calves, right?
Exactly. He was terrified that if the people continued to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, they might eventually turn against him and return to the rule of the house of David.
And so, in a misguided attempt to secure his own power,
right,
he made choices that ultimately led the people away from God.
It's a reminder that fear can be a powerful motivator, but it can also lead us to make decisions that compromise our faith and harm those we are meant to lead.
Yes.
It just goes to show how complicated leadership can be.
I know, it's true.
Sometimes even seemingly good intentions can lead to unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It challenges us to carefully consider the potential impact of our choices, especially when we're in positions of influence.
Right.
We must always seek God's wisdom and guidance, ensuring that our decisions are rooted in faith, not in fear or self-preservation.
Speaking of leadership, we've got to talk about the prophets. We've already touched on Elijah's incredible showdown with the prophets of Baal, but it seems like there's this constant tension between the prophets and the kings throughout the book of 1 Kings.
That's true.
Right.
The prophets often act as the voice of God, challenging the kings when they stray from his path and calling the people back to faithful obedience.
They definitely weren't afraid to speak truth to power, even when it put them in danger.
Exactly. Think about Micaiah, for example.
Okay.
In 1 Kings 22, he dares to contradict the other prophets, even in the presence of King Ahab.
Right.
And he does so knowing that he will likely face punishment for his honesty.
It's a powerful reminder that standing up for what we believe in often comes at a cost.
That's right.
But it's also inspiring to see how courageous these prophets were, standing firm in their faith, even when facing opposition.
It's a challenge to all of us, isn't it?
Yeah.
To cultivate that same courage of conviction, to be willing to speak up for what is right, even when it's difficult. The prophets in 1 Kings remind us that we are all called to be truth tellers, to stand firm in our faith, and to challenge injustice wherever we see it.
It makes you realize that these stories aren't just ancient history.
Right.
They have something to teach us about how we live our lives today.
Absolutely. They offer timeless wisdom and guidance, reminding us of the importance of faith,
right,
obedience, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what we believe in.
You know, one story that keeps coming to mind is the story of Naboth's vineyard.
Oh, yes.
It's such a tragic tale of greed and the abuse of power.
Yes. 1 Kings 21 tells the heartbreaking story of how King Ahab coveted Naboth's vineyard and used his royal authority to unjustly seize it, ultimately leading to Naboth's death.
And the way Jezebel manipulates the situation, orchestrating false accusations and a sham trial, is just horrifying.
It's a chilling example of how easily those in positions of power can exploit others for their own gain.
Yeah.
And it serves as a stark warning against the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of greed.
It really makes you think about how we use our own influence and the importance of using our power, whatever that may be, for good and not for selfish gain.
It's a challenge for all of us, isn't it? To examine our own hearts, to resist the temptations of greed and self-interest, and to use our influence to uphold justice and to care for the vulnerable.
Right.
The story of Naboth's vineyard is a powerful reminder that true leadership is about service, not exploitation.
So we've seen the highs and lows of leadership.
We have.
The powerful role of the prophets.
Yes.
The dangers of material wealth.
Right.
And the consequences of straying from God's path.
That's right.
What other valuable messages do you think we can glean from the book of 1 Kings?
One important theme that emerges is the idea of God's sovereignty.
Okay.
Throughout the book, we see God working through both positive and negative events to accomplish his purposes. Even when things seem chaotic or unpredictable,
right.
God is ultimately in control.
That's a reassuring thought, especially when we consider how turbulent the events of 1 Kings are.
It is. It reminds us that even in the midst of difficult circumstances, we can trust in God's plan and his unwavering love for us.
Right.
We may not always understand his ways, but we can be confident that he is working all things together for good.
That's a powerful message of hope and comfort for believers.
It is. And as we continue our deep dive into 1 Kings, we'll see how this theme of God's sovereignty plays out in even more profound ways.
As we delve deeper into 1 Kings, it's remarkable how these stories written thousands of years ago still speak to us today. The lessons about leadership, faith, and the impact of our choices feel so relevant to our lives right now.
It's true. The human heart hasn't changed all that much, has it? The same struggles and temptations that the people in 1 Kings faced are ones that we still grapple with today. And that's why these stories hold such timeless wisdom for us.
One thing that's been really resonating with me is this idea of interconnectedness. The choices of one king often had a ripple effect impacting generations to come.
Right.
It's like a chain reaction of consequences.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
It reminds us that our actions have far-reaching implications.
Right.
We're not isolated individuals.
Right.
We're part of a community, a family, a nation.
Yeah.
And our decisions, especially those made in positions of authority, can impact not only ourselves, but also those around us and even future generations.
It makes me think about the story of Ahab's decision to go into battle.
Okay.
Despite the warnings from the prophet Micaiah.
Ah, yes. In 1 Kings 22, Ahab receives a clear warning from Micaiah, a prophet who speaks God's truth even when it's difficult to hear.
Right.
But Ahab, surrounded by those who tell him what he wants to hear, chooses to ignore the warning and proceeds with his plans, leading to his own demise.
It's a tragic example of what can happen when we surround ourselves with yes men and ignore wise counsel, even when it's challenging.
Exactly. True leadership requires discernment. A willingness to listen to dissenting voices. And the humility to admit when we're wrong. Ahab's story reminds us that pride and the desire to have our own way can lead to disastrous consequences.
It also connects back to the theme of God's sovereignty that we talked about earlier.
Yes. Even though Ahab attempts to outmaneuver God's plan by disguising himself in battle, God's purposes ultimately prevail. It underscores that we cannot outsmart or manipulate God. His plans will unfold according to his will.
It's a humbling reminder that we are not in control.
And yet, amidst that truth, there's also great comfort. It reminds us that even when we make mistakes, even when things seem chaotic, God is still in control, working everything together for good.
One thing I've appreciated about 1 Kings is how it portrays leadership in a realistic way. We see kings who are described as good, but still make mistakes, or have areas where they fall short.
That's a really important point. It reminds us that even the most faithful leaders are human and prone to error. 1 Kings doesn't shy away from their imperfections, but it also highlights the importance of striving for righteousness. Seeking God's guidance, and asking for his forgiveness when we fall short.
It's a message of grace reminding us that God's love is sufficient to cover our weaknesses and failures.
Yes. It encourages us to approach leadership with humility, recognizing that we all need God's help to lead well.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1 Kings, what are some of the key takeaways that you hope listeners will carry with them?
I hope they'll be encouraged to cultivate a deep and abiding faith in God. Recognizing that he is ultimately in control even when life feels uncertain.
And to remember that obedience to God's word leads to blessing, while choosing our own way often leads to consequences that can impact not only ourselves, but those around us.
Yes. I also hope they'll be inspired by the courage of the prophets to stand up for what's right even when it's difficult. And to speak truth to power.
And perhaps most importantly, to remember that God's grace is always available. His love is constant, and he desires to guide us toward a life of purpose and meaning.
Beautifully said.
As we close our exploration of 1 Kings, we encourage you to dive into this captivating book yourself. Reflect on its stories and consider how its timeless messages can guide you toward a life of deeper faith, greater compassion, and a stronger connection with God.
And as you journey through life, remember that you are not alone. God's presence is always with you, offering guidance, strength, and hope every step of the way.
It's really amazing how much we can learn from these kings and prophets.
Yeah.
Even though their stories are, thousands of years old.
It's true.
They still speak to the challenges we face today as Christians.
Absolutely.
Like trying to live a life that honors God in a world that often pulls us in different directions.
It's not easy.
And, 1 Kings really doesn't sugarcoat the difficulties of following God.
It doesn't.
Does it? We see how even those who start out strong can stumble and fall.
That's right.
And how our choices have these ripple effects.
Yes.
Impacting not only ourselves, but, those around us.
Absolutely.
And even future generations.
1 Kings really underscores the weight of our decisions.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
But, in the midst of all that, I also find it encouraging to see how God's grace and mercy are always present.
Yeah.
Even when people mess up, even when they make really bad choices.
God never gives up on them.
Yeah, he's always there offering forgiveness and a chance to start over.
That's the beauty of God's love, isn't it? It's never too late to turn back to him.
Right.
And he's always ready to welcome us with open arms.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1 Kings, what are some final thoughts or takeaways that you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we're not in this alone. We all face challenges.
Right.
We all make mistakes. But God is always with us.
Yeah.
Offering his guidance, his strength.
Right.
And his unfailing love.
And 1 Kings reminds us that even in the midst of really difficult circumstances, God is working to accomplish his purposes.
Yes.
And that ultimately, he is in control.
It's a message of hope and perseverance for us today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into 1 Kings.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been such a rich and rewarding exploration. And we hope that our listeners have been encouraged and inspired by its timeless message.
I hope so, too.
And until next time, keep seeking God's wisdom and living a life that reflects his love and grace.
Amen to that.